He felt the thrum of the battered cargo vessel before he saw anything amiss. A low, groaning vibration that rippled through the deck plates and rattled the half-empty canteen in his grip. Out in the star-choked vacuum, the station's docking corridor was a faint corridor of steel and battered cables. Jackson Rosser, Jax to the few who knew him, stared through the narrow porthole, bracing for something, anything, to lunge out of the darkness. He had expected trouble the minute his instruments detected this drifting structure on the edge of a radiation-scarred sector. He did not, however, expect the faint flicker of a life sign that appeared as soon as he'd brought the docking clamps online. The console beeped to confirm the atmosphere was stable. In a place like this, no official records, no transponder signals, no sign of recent traffic. It was a toss-up whether the occupant was friend, foe, or something far stranger. But he was running out of rations and needed a place to patch his hull. The cargo bay was leaking, and if he didn't address the microfractures soon, he'd be as good as space dust. He stepped into the corridor with careful, measured strides. Gloved hand on his pistol, he swept the empty walkway. The place smelled stale, the faint odor of recycled air laced with a tang of alien mold. Gravity felt thin, like the station's systems were on emergency power. "Anyone here?" he called, voice echoing along steel. His words felt heavy in his throat. It had been weeks since he'd spoken out loud to anyone but himself. He half expected only silence in return. But then he heard movement, a sudden scuff that set his nerves aflame. He paused, every muscle tensing, but no threat emerged. Just the hush of distant ventilation. Progressing deeper, he came upon a sealed door. His handheld scanner flickered with a single life form on the other side. He crouched, reached for the manual release, expecting some starved stowaway or a malfunctioning droid. Instead, when the door sighed open, he beheld something both mesmerizing and alarming. She stood there in a swirl of half-functional overhead lighting, her silhouette etched in slender arcs and fluid lines. She was tall, taller than him by at least a head, and her skin gleamed with a faint luminescence like the ghost of a moonlit sea. Her hair, or what he could call hair, formed a crown of filaments that shifted colors with her breath. A wave of something intangible coursed between them, like static or the beating pulse of a distant star. She raised one hand, splaying translucent fingers. Each digit seemed jointed in unfamiliar ways. Her eyes were large and reflective, rimmed in a faint gold glow. He had never encountered this species, didn't even have data in the Terran or Coalition archives about them. A swirl of pale luminescence rolled over her cheeks, intensifying as she took another step forward. And then she spoke. At least, he thought it was speech. Her throat pulsed, releasing a hum that nudged at his hearing in a bizarre, sensual way. He tried to respond, heart hammering as he forced his voice even. "Hi there. I'm not a threat. I'm just looking for a place to patch my ship." He tapped his chest with a gloved hand in a slow, universal gesture. "I'm Jackson. Jax." Her eyes roamed to his canteen. She made a sound, throaty and surprisingly deep for her lithe frame. Her gaze locked on the battered metal container. Slowly, as though testing the weight of each motion, she tilted her head and whispered something that manifested in his ears as a silky hush. Then, more clearly, a single word in accented but recognizable Terran. "Water." She advanced so quickly that Jax nearly stumbled back. The station's poor gravity conspired to send him rocking on his heels, but he held his ground. She closed the distance, her luminous hands curving around his canteen. He watched, half hypnotized, as she brushed his arm in the process, a fleeting contact that sent a jolt through his system, as though her very touch carried an electric charge. She unscrewed the lid with a surprising dexterity, brought it to her lips, and drank. Her throat pulsed with each swallow, her filaments shifting from soft teal to a vivid violet. And then she moaned, a sound that vibrated through the stale air and shot a burst of heat straight through his chest. It was an unashamed, primal sound of satisfaction or relief, and it made Jax's face burn with an unaccustomed sense of intimacy. Then she looked at him and demanded, in labored Terran, "More." He nodded, not trusting his voice. He kept an emergency water reservoir on his ship, but that was all the clean supply he had left until he could find a planet with a potable source. Still, the raw desperation in her eyes was unmissable. Her entire being seemed parched, down to her cells. He motioned for her to follow. She stepped closer, the faint glow beneath her skin flaring whenever she inhaled. Her presence felt magnetic, the air around her heavier and somehow more charged. "All right," he murmured, swallowing. "Let's see if I can spare some more." As they walked the corridor back toward the airlock, she fumbled with Terran words. "Who are you? Male human?" She tested the phrase as though she'd heard it somewhere, or read it from a half-working translator. He managed a dry smile. "Yeah," he said quietly. "Male human. And you? Got a name?" She paused mid-step, filaments flickering. She repeated the hum in her own language, then her voice dipped, uncertain, until she landed on a single word. "She calls me Ceres." It sounded half-formed, but it would do for a name. They reached his ship. It was cramped, overshadowed by salvage gear, a salvage net, and a scattering of personal belongings. He rummaged through the supply bins until he unearthed a canister that had roughly half its water left. If she drank more than that, he'd be in trouble. But it didn't stop him. He watched her face, those wide, luminous eyes, and something in him, that last scrap of empathy he'd once shielded behind cynicism, stirred. Her posture screamed thirst, exhaustion, desperation. She took the canister from him and sipped again, moaning with that low resonance. He felt the hair on the back of his neck stand up every time she made that sound. Something so small, a necessity like water, had never seemed so intimate. "Easy," he muttered. "Don't overdo it or you'll make yourself sick." She merely stared at him, brow ridges shifting. He realized her face was not quite human but expressive in a layered, mesmerizing way. He recalled her earlier moan, how it had practically echoed in his body, and swallowed hard. She lowered the container, blinking rapidly, as if trying to process the sensation of water in her system. Her next words came clipped. "Station, lost power, cannot condense water from air." He recognized that she was referencing some environmental system. The oxygen felt musty, stale, as though only partial circulators worked. If the station's internal condenser was offline, she might have been stranded here with no water source for days, maybe weeks. He'd known thirst before, back when he was left for dead on a desert world after a pirate raid took the life of his. He winced. A memory threatened to surface, a pair of small footprints in the sand, too light to last in the wind. He shoved it down. Focus on the present, he told himself, biting off a wave of old grief. "You alone here?" he asked softly. Ceres nodded, pressing a hand to the side of her slender throat. "Alone," she echoed. The station, evidently, was an abandoned frontier outpost. She explained that she'd taken refuge after her own ship malfunctioned. Jax forced calm into his voice as she carefully explained in halting Terran that she had grown up traveling among different stars. She never belonged to any one planet. Her people drifted, building or salvaging technology. He recognized a kindred spirit in that, the rootless existence, a sense of drifting on an endless sea of vacuum. Still, she seemed different. Something about her presence felt larger than the confines of her body, as if she was holding back a deeper power. Once her thirst was slaked, at least for the moment, she moved with a languid grace through the ship, exploring with her eyes and occasional touches. Each time she touched a surface, her filaments sent a faint glow rippling through the immediate area, as if scanning or tasting the environment. He found himself both wary and intrigued. "Ceres," he ventured. "What are you?" She halted, those filament hairs shifting from violet to a subdued blue. "I am dry," she said. "My species. We bond with vessels. We live, we shape them." She trailed off, possibly uncertain how to translate her language's nuance into Terran. Jax rubbed the back of his neck, eyeing the half-lit corridor. He guessed her people might have some biotech synergy, or a form of integrated technology that let them fuse with ships. He'd heard rumors of living architecture used by certain fringe species. Perhaps she was a living extension of that, left stranded. Out the forward port, the station's gloom beckoned. The faint echo of some mechanical rattle told him this place was slowly giving out. He turned to her, noticing that she shivered slightly in the cold. "All right, well," he said quietly. "I've got a bunk, a ration heater, and a single blanket if you need it. This station doesn't seem stable enough for us to stay in. Maybe repatch my ship, refuel, see if we can get both of us out of here?" Her eyes bored into him with a sudden intensity. "Together?" she repeated. "I have no vessel now." For a moment, her face displayed that tragic self-awareness he'd gleaned earlier. She was stranded, vulnerable, but also so alive, her luminescence a flickering testament to an alien vitality. She lowered her gaze. "Yes. I will help fix your ship, if you help me survive." He exhaled, feeling the tension seep out of him. She wasn't brandishing a weapon or demanding control. She was asking. "Deal," he said quietly. "You can crash in my bunk if you want. I'll take the cockpit floor." A flicker of confusion and curiosity crossed her features. "Crash in your bunk?" Her voice, with that slight accent, turned the phrase into a question about literal crashing. He almost laughed but held it back, not wanting to startle her. "It means you can sleep there," he clarified. "It's more comfortable." She nodded slowly, and with a regal tilt of her head, as though dignity and relief battled in her expression, she followed him into the cramped living area. He offered her the single bed, though it was hardly more than a narrow pad along the bulkhead. She studied it, those filaments shifting in color, as if scanning for comfort or toxins. While she settled, Jax busied himself with the console. He'd docked forcibly. The station might have had some fuel or reaction mass stored. If it did, that might buy him enough time to limp to the nearest jump gate. Reaching the gate meant potential rescue or at least an inhabited zone. Yet as he worked, he couldn't shake the echo of her moan after drinking the water. It replayed in his mind unbidden, stirring an odd warmth in his chest. Something about it had crossed the boundary from mere thirst to a raw expression of need. He felt the flush in his cheeks even now, but forced himself to stay focused. She was an alien, for heaven's sake, one whose physiology, culture, everything, was unknown. He hardly had the emotional bandwidth to be drawn to someone again, especially given what he'd lost. He glanced back at her. She lay curled on her side, apparently drifting off, her filaments dimming to a soft lavender. He remembered how her eyes had glowed with such intensity. She was a puzzle, beautiful, haunting, and vulnerable in ways that unsettled him. Restless, he moved to the cockpit, sank onto the threadbare seat, and stared at the half-lit monitors. Her presence had ignited something in him, an urge to protect, or perhaps to keep her from sharing the fate of so many he'd been unable to save. But also, there was something about her that drew him, as though her luminous energy tapped into the hollow places inside him. He sighed and massaged the scar on his forearm, a reminder of the last time he tried to help someone he cared about. Guilt gnawed him. He told himself he was only doing this because it was right, because he wasn't a monster who would abandon a stranded being. But he recognized that was only part of it. The rest, he wasn't ready to admit. He sat there for hours, drifting in a half-sleep, the console's flickers lulling him into a doze. Every so often, a small gasp or whisper from the bunk area pulled his attention, making him start. Once or twice, he heard her murmuring in that alien tongue, punctuated by those low hums. He didn't move to investigate, though an unspoken worry lingered that she might be ill or in pain. In some corner of his mind, he was bracing for betrayal, some predator trap that she might spring. But each time he thought about it, he pictured those luminous eyes, that exhausted slope of her shoulders, and the way she had gulped water as though it was her first taste of hope in days. If this was a trap, it was well played. Eventually, he decided he'd run a final systems check, then get some rest. Tomorrow, he would rummage through the station for repair materials, check for salvageable fuel, and glean any clues about who had built or abandoned it. Maybe get his hull sealed. But as he stood, intending to shut down the overhead lights, he saw her slip into the cockpit. She moved with a sinuous grace, though she still seemed tired, hugging the blanket around her shoulders. I cannot sleep, she confessed. He gestured to the jump seat. Sit. She hesitated, then seated herself, wincing at the squeak of old metal. Your environment is strange, she whispered. Low humidity, different oxygen mix. But not harmful. You'll acclimate, he offered, not sure how best to reassure her. She pressed her fingers to her temple. I hear small echoes. The station. It is singing in a broken way. He frowned. Singing? She nodded, eyes drifting shut as though listening to some frequency beyond his senses. My people, we sense resonance in materials. The hum of power lines. The structure's breath. This station is dying. It cries out, but no one is here to fix it. He studied her for a moment. That sadness in her voice resonated with his own sense of loss, although he didn't fully grasp her ability. She turned to him, something like vulnerability in her luminous gaze. I want to ask more about you, but words are difficult. My translator is partial. I cannot fully connect with you. He recalled a rumor about telepathic bonding or memory exchange used by certain advanced species. Are you able to link minds? He asked carefully, not sure if that was stepping over a boundary. She swallowed, her filaments trembling. Yes, but it is dangerous. She looked away. It would reveal too much. Of me. Of you? I do not want to harm or invade. Her tone suggested she had reason to fear that. He nodded, heart pounding. I see. Maybe later, he said, surprising even himself with the gentleness in his voice. Part of him was curious, drawn to that intimacy. But he also feared what she might see within him, the guilt that shadowed every waking moment. She studied him in silence, her filaments shifting color so softly it was like a gentle aurora. Thank you, she said at last. For water, for rest. He shrugged, forcing a casualness he didn't quite feel. Don't mention it. She touched his arm, an echo of that earlier electric jolt. I will not forget, she said simply. Then, with a small nod, she retreated, leaving him alone to the quiet hum of the console. He stared at the place where her hand had been, a swirl of conflicting emotions rising in him. The weight of it all pressed on his lungs, the knowledge that tomorrow they'd have to risk exploring the station, that they might not find enough resources to fix his ship, that he'd once again face a situation where someone else's life depended on him not failing. He closed his eyes and drew in a breath, feeling the ghost of her touch linger, even as the darkness swallowed the cockpit whole. He woke to a series of chimes from the battered console. Morning in space was a relative concept, but he'd set the ship's computer to run a diagnostic cycle that concluded at dawn. The moment the beep sounded, he rubbed his bleary eyes and forced himself upright. He realized he'd slept in the pilot's seat, a crick in his neck reminding him that comfort was a luxury. Saris was no longer in the bunk, though the blanket was rumpled where she'd been. He felt a little jolt of anxiety. Had she left, or worse, sabotaged something? Then he heard a faint clang from the corridor. He hurried out, only to find her kneeling by an open panel, staring at the tangle of wires with an expression of fierce concentration. Her filaments glowed softly around her shoulders, giving her an otherworldly halo. When she saw him, she offered a slight smile, her accent twisting his name. Jax, I see damage. She pointed to a cluster of frayed cables. Your reactor shunt is not stable. If you jump, you burn the core. His heart dropped. Damn. That's worse than I thought. He'd known something was off, but the damage was evidently more extensive. So is it fixable? He asked. She regarded the cables like a puzzle. Yes. But we need better conduit. Materials from station. Possibly, a small generator from the upper decks. He nodded, impressed by her quick assessment. All right. Then we'll go looking. He held out a pistol and a small handheld scanner. You go armed? He asked gently. Her brows knit in confusion. He offered her the pistol, but she carefully shook her head. I do not shoot, she said softly. My defense is different. He recalled her cryptic comment about being dangerous when triggered. Okay, he said, slipping the pistol into his own belt. Just stay close. She rose, leaning into him for a moment as though balancing in the low gravity. The fleeting pressure of her lithe body against his side made his breath catch. She smelled faintly sweet, an aroma that conjured images of night blossoms in a greenhouse. And then she was stepping away, gesturing for him to lead the way. Together, they exited into the station's corridor. The emergency lights flickered, casting elongated shadows across the scuffed metal. Saris walked with silent steps, her attention flicking to the piping overhead. She trailed her fingers across the walls, occasionally humming in a low pitch. He realized she might be scanning the station the same way she did with his ship. Sometimes, her hum caught an echo in the metal, resonating like a tuning fork. She would pause, cock her head, and then move on. Along the way, they passed empty quarters, the doors jammed open. In one, a deserted bunk with a single blanket rotted in stale air. In another, a storage room half flooded with coolant, the stench enough to make Jax gag. He forced the door closed again. Every corner whispered a story of sudden abandonment, a station left to rot in the dark. She asked quietly in her broken Terran. Where did they go? He shook his head. No clue. Could have been a meltdown or a radiation breach. Or pirates came by. Or maybe the owners just ran out of funds. Out here, anything goes. She frowned at that answer, her eyes flickering with a disturbed light. They descended a small ladder into a lower deck. The scraping of his boots on the rungs echoed. Saris paused halfway, letting out a quiet moan of displeasure at the cramped confines. He felt a spike of heat at the memory of her moan the previous night, but quickly shoved that aside. She was just uncomfortable, not delirious with need for water this time. Still, a flicker of color pulsed along her filaments, like an unconscious response to her emotional state. Easy, he said, offering a hand as she stepped onto the deck. She accepted the gesture, and again, that faint current passed between them. Her fingertips felt warm, almost too warm. They navigated a corridor that ended in a locked hatch labeled in an unknown script. His scanner indicated higher radiation levels beyond the hatch, though still within tolerable limits if they kept exposure short. Might be a generator in there, he mused. We just need a few parts. Saris nodded and pressed her ear, more precisely, the side of her head with those shifting filaments, against the hatch. She let out a slow exhalation, humming a note that vibrated in the metal. Then she gave a quick nod. Generator is inside, she said in that soft voice. I hear the hum. Dying but not dead. He forced the hatch with a crowbar, the metal screeching in protest. The door gave, revealing a chamber lined with machinery. A dull haze of golden light pulsed from half-broken panels, while a leaking coolant pipe hissed in the corner. Jax flipped on his handheld lamp. Watch your step. If you see any signs of radiation leak, back off. She took a cautious step forward. I sense no deadly breach. Just leftover residue. They inched deeper. The floor was sticky with some fluid that might once have been lubrication. Everything smelled of rust and chemical decay. Yet, in the center stood a squat machine with coil-like protrusions. Jax's eyes lit up. That's our baby. If it's got a functioning stabilizer coil, we can salvage it. Saris circled the machine, occasionally pressing her palm against various points. He watched with fascination. Each time, her filaments flared in a new color sequence, and she muttered half-formed words in her own language. It is old. But... She broke off, yanking at a panel. With a grunt, she pried it open, revealing a labyrinth of wires. The coil glowed faintly. Jax's heart soared. Perfect. We'll just have to hope it's not cracked. He set to work, rummaging through a toolkit for a handheld plasma cutter. Saris watched him carefully, sometimes offering suggestions in her halting Terran. No, cut higher. You see the node? He nodded, following her directions. Her knowledge of technology was uncanny. Within half an hour, they freed the coil assembly, a jagged piece of metal stuck to its underside. She wiped coolant off the surface, squinting at the device. Stable, she pronounced. He grinned, surprising himself with the warmth of the expression. I owe you one, Saris. They headed back toward the exit, coil in hand. Partway, a shudder rippled through the station. A metallic groan reverberated in the corridor. Saris stiffened. Something collapsing, she whispered, eyes darting. He looked around, noticing that the lights flickered more erratically. We'd better get out of here, now. Together, they broke into a run, footsteps reverberating in the nearly weightless hush. Smoke began to curl from vents overhead, as though a system somewhere had finally given up. They veered around corners, retracing their route. At one point, a chunk of ceiling plating crashed down, forcing them to leap aside. He swore under his breath, heart pounding. If the entire station was about to go, they had little time to fix his ship and escape. He felt Saris at his shoulder, her breathing ragged, eyes bright with urgency. She pressed him onward, unrelenting. They burst through the main corridor and into the docking clamp area. He let out a shaky breath. The clamp still held. He guided Saris across the threshold into his ship, which felt comparatively safe despite the precarious hull damage. Sealing the airlock behind them, he latched the interior door. Only then did he realize how hard he was breathing, adrenaline coursing through his veins. Saris leaned against the wall, looking equally spent. Her filaments still pulsed with a frantic, high-frequency color shift. He wanted to reach out, to steady her, but hesitated. You okay? He asked gently. She nodded, swallowing hard. Yes. Just the station's meltdown is sad. It is like hearing the final breath of something that once lived. He exhaled, raking a hand through his tangled hair. We might not have time for sadness. We fix the ship now or get buried out there. They moved to the engine compartment. The next couple of hours bled together in an intense flurry of work. Saris guided him through reconnections, splicing cables, bridging circuits. Occasionally, she closed her eyes and hummed that odd, resonant note that seemed to help her sense the currents flow behind the walls. Jax was deeply grateful. Without her, he'd have likely blown a fuse or welded the wrong circuit. He found himself marveling at her slender arms, how they handled the heavy coil with surprising strength and precision. Whenever he had to lean close, the warmth of her body reminded him of that electric spark he'd felt. He kept his focus resolute, not letting his mind wander to the way her voice had trembled with relief when she first drank his water, or how she had moaned with such raw need. After a final calibration, Jax keyed in a test sequence. The reactor lights flickered to life. The coil glowed a steady green in the readout. We did it, he murmured, a sense of relief flooding him. Ship's at least capable of boosting away from the station. Maybe even a short jump if we can find a gate. He turned to Saris, and for the first time since they'd met, he saw a real smile curl her alien lips. It was subtle, but it lit her eyes. She reached out and gripped his shoulder. You saved me, she said softly. I repay. He barked a dry laugh. Team effort. You did most of the fancy scanning. She shook her head, her filaments drifting into an affectionate shade. No. You gave water. Shelter. Trust. That is, more than I have had from any being. A twinge of sadness tightened his chest. He recognized that feeling, being isolated, unconnected, drifting alone in the void. Well, he managed to say. You helped me too. So maybe we're even. She stood close, closer than comfort typically allowed, but he found he didn't mind. The air between them felt charged, humming with a tension that straddled curiosity and a faint, blossoming desire. He remembered the rules of space: no illusions, no easy outs. The vacuum was merciless. People formed bonds fast out here or they died alone. He coughed, stepping back before the moment stretched too far. Let's check if we can detach from the station and move to a safer orbit. She nodded, the glow subsiding in her filaments. He led her to the cockpit, ignoring the slight tremor in his hands that had nothing to do with mechanical strain. They managed to boost away from the station just as a series of structural collapses tore it apart in a slow, silent, vacuum-ravaged implosion. Jax watched from the cockpit window, heart heavy at the sight of twisted metal spiraling away into the blackness. Sarah stood behind him, her arms wrapped around her own torso. "It's gone," he said, feeling the words stick in his throat. She lowered her head. "Yes." The station had no caretaker. It was only a matter of time. He glanced up at her, catching the distant reflection of starlight in her eyes. "Are you sure you weren't attached to it? Some part of you seemed connected." She shook her head, filaments flickering with faint sadness. "Not attached. Just empathic." He almost asked her to elaborate, but she moved away, quietly indicating that the discussion was over. He turned his attention to the ship's scanners. The readout wasn't promising, a few scattered anomalies, but no direct route to known shipping lanes. "Nearest jump gate is at least a week's journey, if we stretch our resources." He sighed. "We're short on fuel, water is down to less than half, and rations, well, let's just say it'll be a lean week." He saw Saris shift uncomfortably. She knew she was a burden on those resources. He could read the guilt in her posture. Quickly, he added, "We'll manage. I've done more with less." A flicker of relief crossed her face. They set a course on minimal power, letting momentum carry them through the quiet vacuum. Without the station's immediate crisis, there was time to breathe, and also time for tension. Stuck in a small vessel, two strangers with complicated histories and deeper wounds. Jax found chores to keep himself busy, checking hull integrity, calibrating the NAV computer, reorganizing salvage parts. Each time he passed Saris in the corridor, their eyes briefly locked, a quiet swirl of unspoken emotions passing between them. She asked him about Earth, about how humans lived. He answered with short, guarded explanations. He told her how he wasn't exactly from Earth, that he'd been born in a lunar colony, but Earth was his ancestral home. She asked if he missed it. He shrugged, not wanting to discuss the reasons he'd never felt at home anywhere. In the quiet hum of the ship, the lines between them gradually blurred. She'd help him prepare the meager meals, asking questions about the ration packs with childlike curiosity. "This is freeze-dried protein? Strange." She'd wrinkle her nose at the texture, or moan softly in a mixture of curiosity and mild distaste. He found himself laughing more than he had in ages at her little misunderstandings of slang. When he mentioned killing time, she'd go wide-eyed in alarm until he explained it was just an expression. Sometimes he'd catch her studying him from across the cabin with a thoughtful intensity, her filaments shifting in gentle waves. Each time, an odd warmth spread in his chest, a recognition that she was seeing him with fresh eyes. That day, they reached the midpoint of their journey to the gate. He checked the water supply, a grim reading. They had maybe 3 days left at half rations. He tried not to dwell on how her thirst seemed insatiable, though she was careful not to overindulge after that first day. She must have realized how precarious the situation was. He found her kneeling by a ventilation duct, filaments fully extended in a questing posture. "What are you doing?" he asked softly. She looked up. "Trying to draw moisture from the air, the condensation in vents. A trick my people sometimes do." She parted her lips and inhaled, as though tasting the air, eyes half-lidded in concentration. Then she frowned, as though disappointed in the results. "Not enough humidity," she sighed. He pressed his lips together, feeling a stab of pity. "We'll find a way," he murmured. She studied him for a long moment. "Yes. Together." 1 cycle later, a sensor alarm chimed. Jax rushed to the cockpit to find a faint reading, a derelict vessel, drifting about half a day's journey away. "Could be a trap," he muttered, scowling at the console. "But we need resources. If it's got water or fuel." He didn't have to finish. Saris nodded. "Worth the risk." The tension between them was palpable, an undercurrent of shared desperation. They plotted a course to intercept. As they approached, the vessel's lines became visible through the forward viewport, a slender craft of unknown design, dark hull battered by meteor impacts. No lights, no signs of life. Jax tried hailing it, receiving only static in return. "All right, we'll do a quick EVA," he decided. "See if we can scavenge anything." He prepared the airlock, suiting up in a patchwork vac suit. Ceres followed him into the cramped airlock. He turned, noticing how the suit she tried to wear was too big, drifting around her slight frame. Her luminous skin glimmered in the faint overhead light. "This might not fit well," he said apologetically. She shrugged with a small smile. "I adapt." Then came a charged moment. He was about to seal the helmet over her head when the ship lurched. A micro-collision? He grabbed onto a rail, nearly colliding with Ceres's chest. She let out a startled sound, half laugh, half gasp. Their eyes locked. She was so close he could see the shimmering flecks in her irises, sensed the heat radiating from her. For a breathless second, time slowed. Her slender fingers brushed his waist as she steadied herself. He felt the spark again, that electric tingle that skittered up his spine. He swallowed, heart pounding. She whispered, "Your eyes look frightened." He forced a tight smile. "I'm not used to company. That's all." He gently lowered her helmet into place before she could see the deeper flicker of desire that still rattled his composure. They floated across the short distance between ships, tethered by a cable. The derelict's hull bore scorch marks and fissures from what looked like a skirmish. Carefully, they found an airlock, forced it open, and crept inside. The interior was pitch black except for their suit lamps. Jax's pulse thudded in his ears. Every salvage run dredged up old memories, how he'd once boarded a vessel like this, searching for survivors, only to find the cold bodies of. He cut off the memory, focusing on the present. If Ceres sensed his turmoil, she didn't comment. She hovered nearby, scanning the darkness with calm precision. They found the cargo bay. A handful of crates were strapped to the floor. Jax pulled one open to reveal food packs, alien, but possibly edible. Another crate revealed canisters that might contain some form of water or fluid. He exhaled in relief. Ceres signaled him to check the canisters with the scanner. Low-level radiation, but likely filtered water. He gave her a thumbs up, and though her helmet hid her face, he sensed her relief. They moved deeper, searching for fuel cells. Past a corridor littered with floating debris, they located the engine room. One large cylinder was cracked, vented to vacuum. But another was intact. Jax quickly extracted it, hooking it to his tether line. Then Ceres signaled him with an urgent gesture. He drifted over to see her shining a light into a compartment. Inside, a console still glowed faintly. She pointed to it with an air of reverence. The language was incomprehensible, but it looked like advanced biotech, some interface that might link to her species' skill set. He guessed she wanted to see if it held star charts or something else of value. She glanced at him in question. He nodded. "Sure, we have time," he said into the calm, her eyes lit with renewed purpose. She gently placed her hands on the console. Even through the vacuum suit, she seemed able to sense something. Then she frowned, a soft hiss crackling over the radio. "It's locked." "Wait." She hummed that resonant note. He saw the faint glow of her filaments even through the visor, a blossoming aura. Suddenly, the console lit up with a swirl of alien glyphs. A faint hum reverberated through the ship. Jax's suit sensors flickered, reading a slight power surge. "Careful," he warned. She nodded, focusing intently on the console, her slender fingers tapping. After a moment, the glyphs coalesced into a star map. Jax recognized some patterns, a remote system near the boundary of known space. Possibly the origin of this ship. He felt a pang of curiosity. Could it be Ceres's home system? Her breathing grew labored as she interfaced, sweat beading on her forehead. Then she gasped, withdrawing her hand. "Can't fully connect," she muttered over the comm. "Memory is fragmented." "But—" She tapped a few more commands. Data scrolled by. Then the console flickered and died. She drifted back, panting. "That's all I can do." He placed a reassuring hand on her elbow. "Let's get back." We got enough to survive. She nodded, her posture trembling. As they made their way back to the airlock, he felt her body leaning heavily on his. The effort must have cost her. He felt protective instincts surge unbidden. He reminded himself not to get attached. Not to let the old patterns of hope and heartbreak take root. But the more she let him help, the deeper the seed lodged inside him. Back on his ship, they stowed the salvaged water and fuel. Once they resealed the airlock and removed their helmets, the tension of the last few hours cascaded into relief. Sarah sank to the deck, letting out a long exhale. He knelt beside her. You okay? She nodded, blinking away exhaustion. Yes. That was intense. My kind, we can integrate with machines, but it costs energy. I never fully bonded with a foreign system in vacuum before. He felt a pang of admiration. Well, let's get you some water. Seems we have a bit more to spare now. She managed a tired laugh. Their next days settled into a pattern of cautious optimism. With the new supplies, they had enough water to satisfy both their needs, enough fuel to reach the jump gate if they rationed. They took turns monitoring the console, scanning for any sign of ships. When they were off duty, they found themselves sharing cramped space, telling small stories about their lives. Sarah spoke in halting phrases, describing how she'd grown up aboard a living vessel her people cultivated, each dry forming a bond that linked mind and hull. It is like a womb and a home, she tried to explain. We are taught to feel the pulses, to sing with the structures. We are never alone. He swallowed at the faint tremor in her voice. Until now, he ventured gently. She nodded, tears shimmering at the edges of her eyes. Until now, she asked about him. He hedged, gave general answers about drifting from job to job. She pressed him, noticing the sadness in his voice. Why do you not go home? She asked one evening. He sighed, running a hand over stubble on his jaw. Because I failed. He paused, the admission scraping his throat. The memory weighed on him, a leaden ache. I couldn't protect someone. Someone I loved. When I needed to come through, I was too late. It cost me everything. I can't face my old life. His voice broke, surprising him. He'd never said it so plainly. Not in years. Saris reached out, placed a hand on his. Her luminous skin felt warmer than usual. She didn't speak, just let the moment stretch in understanding. A flutter of gratitude coursed through him, mingled with the ever-present guilt. Yet something about her quiet acceptance loosened the tight coil in his chest. He almost wanted to keep talking, but his throat closed. Instead, he squeezed her hand in silent thanks. Several days later, the jump gate loomed on the scanners, a ring of battered metal swirling with faint energy. We made it, Jax whispered, exhaling in relief. We'll have to pay a toll or hack it. But at least we're back in some semblance of civilization. He glanced at Saris, expecting a smile. Instead, her filaments were flickering with anxiety. I can't go to a human port, she murmured. They will. I am unknown. Might be detained. Her worry was valid. The coalition, while not overtly xenophobic, enforced strict protocols on unregistered species. The last thing either of them needed was to get tangled in bureaucratic suspicion. We'll slip through, he reassured. We'll keep your presence quiet. If we're quick, no one's going to board a junker like mine. It's not worth their time. She remained uneasy, but nodded. As they approached the gate, Jax began the handshake sequence. A gruff voice crackled over the comm, demanding credentials. Jax, adopting his usual sarcastic charm, provided the equivalent of Merc ID tags. He'd once been legit, and though it was outdated, the gate's system might not catch the discrepancy. Sweat broke along his hairline as he watched the console. Finally, a beep signaled acceptance. Proceed, the voice droned. He huffed in relief, piloting the ship into alignment. The gate flared to life, swirling cosmic energies around them. Saris grabbed the seat, eyes widening in a mixture of awe and trepidation. First jump, she muttered. He nodded, feeling an unexpected surge of protectiveness. Don't worry, I got you, he said quietly. Then the jump engaged, wrenching them through a disorienting swirl of lights. The ship rattled. Everything shook in a wave of cosmic pressure. He heard Ceres's gasp, felt the fear thrumming in her. On the verge of blacking out, he reached over and clasped her hand. For a heartbeat, reality bent around them, a kaleidoscope of starfields. Her filaments flared in wild colors. Then, with a lurch, they emerged on the other side. The console beeped frantically, normalizing readings. Jax blinked spots from his vision, checking for hull integrity. "We're alive," he managed, forcing a shaky grin. Ceres's gaze was glassy, her breathing harsh. Slowly, color returned to her face. She looked at him with something like wonder. "You do this often?" He laughed, short and breathless. "Not if I can help it. But hey, we made it." The local traffic system pinged, showing a small outpost station about a day away. Past that, a scattering of habitable worlds. Options opened before them. Yet the weight of the unknown pressed heavy. "What's your plan from here?" he asked, glancing at Ceres. She stared at the star map, silent. "My people. I do not know if any are near. I am alone. Perhaps I stay with you?" She said it tentatively, as though expecting rejection. A swirl of conflicted emotions flooded Jax. Part of him wanted to keep her safe, to let her continue traveling with him. Another part knew how dangerous it was to get attached, to carry that burden of responsibility. He thought about the broken station, about her thirst, about that time he lost everything. Fear battled a deeper longing. Finally, he cleared his throat. "You could. If you want." Her filaments glowed with relief. She rested her hand lightly on his. "I do," she whispered. His heart twisted in his chest. They set a course, falling into the rhythms of extended travel. The tension between them grew with each passing hour, a slow burn of emotions that neither addressed but both felt. The cramped quarters magnified each subtle glance. She would drift into the cockpit to watch him pilot, occasionally brushing against his back. He'd feel that spark each time, a mixture of curiosity and desire. Late at night, while she rested in his bunk, he found himself lingering near the doorway, listening to her breathe. In the hush, a memory surfaced of how he once watched over another's sleep, a memory that made his chest ache with guilt and yearning. She was not the same. He would not fail again. So he told himself. Amid the tension, small moments of humor emerged. One day, as they shared a meal, she picked up a ration bar. "What is chocolate?" she asked, pronouncing it like a foreign deity. He smirked. "A sweet that humans are addicted to." She sniffed it and took a tentative bite. Her face twisted in a dramatic blend of rapture and confusion. Then she let out a soft moan, a playful echo of that first day with the water. Jax nearly choked on his own ration bar, cheeks flushing. She snorted in amusement at his reaction. It was their first genuine laughter together, and it did something to him, softened the edges, lowered his guard. Her filaments danced with a bright glow that matched the warmth in his chest. But the closer they drew, the more terrified he became of losing her. His nightmares returned, replays of the day he'd arrived too late to save everything he cherished. He'd wake in a sweat, heart hammering, the station's corridors replaced by those desert dunes that once claimed lives he was meant to protect. One such night, he woke with a start, breath ragged. The cabin was dim, the overhead lights low. He found Ceres sitting beside him, luminous in the darkness. She'd sensed his distress. He froze. Her gaze shone with empathy. Gently, she lifted one hand, brushing fingertips against his temple. He didn't pull away. He craved the warmth of her touch, the sense of connection that might anchor him. Her voice was soft as she whispered, "I see your pain." A tremor ran through him. "I don't want you to," he rasped, though the protest was weak. She hushed him gently, her filaments flaring. "I can help, if you let me in. My people, we share memories. We can carry burdens together. But it is intimate, and can be frightening." He studied her face, heart pounding. This was the line he dreaded, the threshold of vulnerability. If he let her see that darkness, that self-blame, would she recoil? Yet some part of him yearned for it. He mustered a nod. "Show me." She closed her eyes, and a hush fell. Her skin glowed as she leaned forward, pressing her brow to his. A gentle, pulsing warmth seeped into him. His vision blurred, and then he was awash in sensations not his own, flickers of her memories, half-formed images of ships, alien laughter, the swirl of an organic corridor. Sorrow battered him, her sense of exile, of losing her bond. Simultaneously, her mind touched his grief, the desert, the silhouette of someone he loved, lost forever. An overwhelming surge of guilt and heartbreak racked him, but she was there, steady, her presence enveloping him with acceptance. He gasped, tears burning his eyes, and felt her tears too. They were sharing pain, bridging the chasm with an unspoken language. It was raw, terrifying, yet painfully beautiful. After what felt like an eternity, they broke apart. He found himself trembling, tears spilling silently. She was weeping as well, luminescence crackling along her filaments. He stared at her, chest heaving, overwhelmed. She spoke in a trembling whisper. "You did not fail from lack of love." He closed his eyes, unable to speak. She shifted closer, arms hesitantly wrapping around him. He let himself be held. It was the first real comfort he'd allowed in so long he'd lost track. In her embrace, he felt a slow, powerful wave of relief break over him, washing away the old poison. It didn't vanish entirely, but it dimmed enough for him to breathe again. He realized she was trembling as well. He smoothed a hand across her back, where her filaments shimmered. A deep ache of compassion welled up. "You lost your bond too," he murmured. "Your home." She nodded, tears shining. "My ship died. I was severed. It is like losing a part of myself." He cradled her cheek, feeling a rising swirl of emotions. "I'm sorry," he managed. She shook her head. "You share my sorrow. You did not turn away." They stayed like that for a long time, breathing each other in, hearts pounding in unison. Her presence was at once alien and intimately close, an undeniable connection that both scared and thrilled him. They parted gently, uncertain smiles ghosting across their faces. An unspoken shift had taken place, forging a deeper bond. The nightmares might never fully leave him, but now he was not alone in them. She had touched his darkness and hadn't recoiled. He'd glimpsed her trauma and stood firm beside her. The space between them felt charged with new possibility. But it also blazed with caution. This was a threshold, and crossing it would change everything. In the hush of the ship's corridor, they simply breathed, letting the moment speak for them. As they neared the outpost, the swirl of new concerns broke into their fragile bubble. The outpost authorities might question them, demand registration, or impose quarantines. Jax planned a discreet approach. He'd dock, gather essential supplies, avoid too many questions, then depart. Saris agreed to remain hidden during docking procedures. Yet a subtle tension clung to her. He noticed how her filaments stayed a subdued hue, her eyes distant. On the final approach, he asked, "You all right?" She forced a small nod. "Yes. Just nervous. Humans do not know dry. They might fear me." He grimaced, recalling humanity's complicated track record with the unknown. "We'll keep it quick." The docking clamps engaged. Jack slid open the main hatch, stepping out onto the outpost's metallic platform. The place was as worn and seedy as he remembered from past visits: hissing vents, flickering neon signs, and a handful of suspicious gazes from passers-by. But it offered resources for sale if one had the credits. He negotiated with a local scrap merchant for repair plates, topped off the fuel reserves from a shady vendor who didn't bother with background checks, and bought extra water canisters. It all cost more than he had, forcing him to pawn some salvage. But he'd manage. Anything to ensure Saris didn't thirst again. Returning to the ship with a hovercart of supplies, he found Saris peeking out from the airlock, her curiosity overriding caution. "You shouldn't be seen," he hissed softly, ushering her back inside. She pouted, filaments flickering with mild irritation. I hear so many voices. Different smells. It is overwhelming. He softened. I know. Just give me a bit longer. Then we'll leave. She nodded, retreating to the corridor with that regal grace. He stowed the supplies, locking down the cargo bay. A distant longing pulled at him. A part of him wanted to show her the station, to see her reaction to the bizarre mosaic of galactic species. But it was too risky. Once everything was secure, he started the launch sequence. But as the engines warmed up, an official comm pinged the console. Attention unidentified vessel, please stand by for routine inspection. Jax's stomach twisted. He cursed under his breath. Ceres, alarmed, hovered in the doorway. What is it? He grimaced. They want to board us. Fear flared in her eyes. They will find me. He flicked switches, heart pounding. The last thing they needed was official scrutiny. I'll stall them. Hide in the aft compartment. Keep quiet. She hesitated, worry etched across her features. Don't let them take you, she whispered. He gave a terse nod, ignoring the uneasy warmth in his chest. A squad of 3 inspectors arrived. Jax forced a pleasant grin, letting them see a grizzled scavenger who could barely keep his ship afloat. Sure. Check what you need, he said, playing the part of a compliant pilot. One inspector looked around the cramped cockpit, scanning for contraband. Another rummaged in the cargo bay. They asked about his route, his business. He mumbled about salvage runs, carefully leaving out any mention of a certain luminous alien. His pulse hammered each time one of them drifted near the aft compartment. Eventually, they seemed satisfied. Or maybe they just didn't want to get dirty rummaging through his junk. They left, sealing the hatch behind them. Jax slumped against the console, tension draining. Ceres emerged, eyes wide. They did not sense me, she murmured, relief tinged with surprise. Sometimes official laziness is our best friend, he said with a wry smile. She returned a small, tentative grin. Then her expression sobered. Thank you? A thread of unspoken gratitude and deeper emotion wove between them. They launched, leaving the outpost behind. The tension of near capture stirred something raw in them both. Surviving that brush with discovery only cemented their bond further. Safe in open space, they breathed easier. Over the next few days, the last walls between them eroded. Late one evening, they shared a meal in the tiny galley corner. Ceres carefully sipped a mug of water. She took each swallow slowly now, a far cry from the desperate gulps of their first day. When she set the mug down, she looked at him with an intensity that made his chest tighten. I want to speak of closeness, she said. Heat rushed to his cheeks. He lowered his gaze. Oh? She nodded, filaments shimmering. We have shared minds a little. But dry also bond physically. It is like a resonance. We share breath, touch, even fluid. A wave of recognition and arousal swept through him at the mention of fluid, remembering the moan that had haunted him. Are you asking me to? She leaned closer, resting a hand on his chest. Her luminous eyes glowed. Yes. But only if you wish. I feel drawn to you. Our hearts, our memories. We are more than strangers now. He swallowed, every nerve alive with awareness of her. This was a turning point, and the weight of it pressed on him. He thought of his guilt, the fear of failing someone again. But then he saw the gentle vulnerability in her gaze. The longing that mirrored his own. I do want that, he whispered at last. A trembling exhale escaped her lips, and her filaments flared in a dance of color. Then we do this, together. They drifted from the galley to the living area in a haze of charged silence, each step a slow, deliberate approach. He reached the bunk, turning to face her. The faint overhead light cast shifting shadows across her luminous skin, tracing the gentle curves that set her apart from any human woman he'd known. Her filaments stood erect, trembling with anticipation. She stepped into his arms, and he felt that familiar electric jolt, magnified tenfold by the raw desire in her eyes. She pressed her hands to his chest, sliding upward until her fingers curled around the back of his neck. Her breath hitched. "Show me how humans embrace," she whispered. He leaned in, heart thunderous in his chest, and brushed his lips to hers, tentative at first, unsure how her alien physiology would respond. But she let out a soft moan, parting her lips. She tasted faintly sweet, with a metallic undertone that sent sparks across his tongue. Her skin pulsed beneath his hands, temperature rising. One of her legs slid alongside his, capturing him in a slow, sensuous entanglement. He responded with growing hunger, letting years of pent-up loneliness pour into the moment. The bunk was just wide enough for them to sit side by side, exploring each other's warmth. She coaxed him deeper, guiding his hand along her flank. Her body felt different, firmer in some places, softer in others, but it all thrilled him. As their breaths tangled, she hummed low in her throat, a resonant vibration that seemed to reverberate through his bones. He gasped, feeling the hum spiral through his core, unlocking a deep surge of arousal. His hand slid along the curve of her waist, finding a pattern of subtle ridges that glowed under his touch. She arched into him, filaments flaring brilliant shades of gold and violet. "Yes," she whispered against his mouth. "That is good." He chuckled breathlessly, burying his face against her neck, inhaling that sweet scent. The tension coiled tighter, an intoxicating swirl of lust and emotional release. They took their time, each uncertain step made easier by mutual curiosity and heartfelt desire. Her moans resonated in low, throaty tones, echoing that first moment she tasted water. Except now, it was a deeper, shared thirst. At one point he paused, cupping her face. "Is this okay for you?" She nodded fervently, eyes hazy with need. "Yes, deeper," she urged. An unfamiliar flush warmed her alien cheeks. "We, dry, can share more." She pressed her forehead to his, and he felt that psychic undercurrent flicker between them again, a gentle stirring of combined emotions. This time, it was desire, compassion, a swirl of budding love. He let it flow in, no longer afraid, letting her see the depth of what she meant to him. Their clothing fell away by mutual agreement, until skin touched skin, and filaments glowed against the rough planes of his chest. He cradled her in his arms, marveling at every new sensation. She took the lead at times, pressing her weight into him with a confident sensuality. At other times, she yielded, letting him explore her curves and ridges, each caress drawing fresh moans that rippled with that signature resonance. It was a dance of two different species bridging a gulf with pure, unfiltered vulnerability. When the final barrier broke, their bodies joined in a slow, careful union. He hissed at the alien slickness, a soft, warm environment that enveloped him in pulses. She released a trembling cry that morphed into that hum, flooding him with vibrations that made his nerves sing. Their minds brushed again, images flashing from his memories to hers, the desert, the station, the taste of water, a home long lost among the stars, a vow of loyalty. Tears pricked his eyes at the rawness of it, but she kissed them away, her lips forming a silent promise. She clung to him as if he were her anchor in a vast, uncertain cosmos. The pace rose and fell, each breath a shared heartbeat in the cramped bunk. At the edge of climax, he heard her whisper broken words, recalling her first confusion about killing time, or the way she moaned over water. She repeated those phrases with a breathless laugh, referencing their earlier banter. It struck him as painfully intimate, how these small moments of humor had become threads in the tapestry of their bond. He murmured her name in response, voice shaking. When release finally crashed over them, it was a tidal wave of pleasure wrapped in emotional catharsis. She cried out, filaments sparking with a dazzling radiance that bathed the cabin in trembling light. He groaned, burying his face against her neck as he rode the crest, heart bursting with something that felt dangerously close to love. Afterward, they lay entwined, chests rising and falling in tandem. The air smelled of salt, sweat, and her sweet alien musk. He brushed a damp filament from her brow. She gazed at him with half-lidded affection, her voice a husky whisper. "I have never felt this." He let out a shaky exhale. "Me either. Not like this." She nuzzled closer, pressing her forehead to his. A final wave of mental connection rippled through them. This time, it felt more stable, a gentle hum that suggested an ongoing bond rather than a passing flare. He realized then that something fundamental had changed. They were no longer merely companions. They were bound by a shared vulnerability that transcended species. He pressed a kiss to her temple, ignoring the knot in his throat. If losing her would destroy him, so be it. Some connections were worth the risk. Their bond deepened in the days that followed, both physically and emotionally. The ship sailed through star lanes, each day a new chance to learn more about each other's cultures. Ceres taught him fragments of her language, hums and rhythms that shaped meaning. He shared human stories, from comedic misadventures to sorrow-laced legends. Their closeness was not without challenges. Sometimes, the raw openness that came with mental sharing was overwhelming. He learned to sense her moods through the flicker of her filaments, the timbre of her hums. She, in turn, realized that every passing mention of deserts or lost loved ones caused a ripple of grief in him. They navigated those emotional minefields with gentle care, forging a trust that felt unshakable. One evening, they sat in the cockpit watching the swirl of a distant nebula. Hues of purple and turquoise danced across the void. She rested her head on his shoulder. "We are nearing systems with more humans," she observed quietly. "You could find real work, or go back to your old life." He snorted. "I have no old life. Not anymore." He pressed a kiss to the top of her head. "And as for work, I figure we'll keep scavenging, or maybe find a place where your talents can shine." She looked up, luminous eyes full of a cautious hope. "We? You want me to stay?" He brushed a filament from her cheek, nodding. "You're part of this crew if you'll have me." Her smile brightened, and she threaded her fingers through his. For a moment, everything felt right. They soon discovered rumors of a planet rumored to be home to advanced biotech research, a place that might resonate with Ceres's dry heritage. Jack set a course, brimming with optimism that perhaps they could find a safe haven. Along the way, they took on small salvage jobs, earning enough credits to keep afloat. In one operation, they rescued a stranded cargo shuttle. In gratitude, the pilot offered them a lead on a dry rumor, whispers of a traveling bioship that had been seen near a remote cluster. Ceres's heart leapt at the prospect of finding her people. Jack shared her excitement, though a pang of fear flickered. If she reconnected with her own kind, would she leave him behind? He swallowed the worry, determined not to hold her back. They arrived at the planet, a water world with shimmering turquoise seas that sparkled under twin suns. The floating city that served as a landing port was a labyrinth of coral-like structures grown from synthetic organisms. Ceres was enthralled, her filaments shining with childlike wonder as they walked along the damp, living walkways. She kept close to Jack's, but he sensed her yearning to explore. He held her hand firmly, determined to stand by her side. They found a research enclave run by a group of hybrid scientists. A stern but curious researcher named Dr. Core recognized something in Ceres's physiology. "You share similarities with a species rumored in the outer belts," he murmured. "We have scraps of data. If you want to search for them, we can offer assistance." Excitement warred with apprehension in Ceres's eyes. She looked to Jax for reassurance. He squeezed her fingers. "Go for it," he said softly. "If this is a chance to find your people, you should take it." Her expression brightened. Yet a shadow of uncertainty lingered. "And you?" He forced a lopsided smile. "I'll be here. I'm not leaving you." Her relief was palpable. The days that followed were filled with tests, scans, and deciphering old star charts. Dr. Cord discovered leads on a drifting bioship that matched the Dry's unique energy signature. "It appears to be in a distant sector, but we can narrow down the region if you share more data," Cord told Ceres one afternoon. She nodded. Yet as the days wore on, her mood grew pensive. Jax noticed her filaments rarely flared with their usual brilliance. "What's wrong?" he asked one night, after the lab closed. She confessed in a soft voice. "I fear what if they do not accept me? I am bonded to you now. Different. Changed." He stroked her cheek, a pang of empathy twisting inside him. I don't know your people. But if they're anything like you, they'll want you to be happy. Right? She gave a sad smile. Maybe. He drew her into his arms. Whatever happens, I'm with you. She pressed her lips to his, seeking comfort in his warmth. He kissed her back, ignoring the swirl of uncertainties. For the first time in years, he felt part of something bigger than his own regret. But it wasn't all smooth. The second week in the floating city, a group of local security guards approached them. Word had spread about an unregistered alien living in the labs. They demanded Saris submit to official examination. Dr. Kaur tried to intervene, but bureaucracy was unyielding. They threatened quarantine or deportation. Fear and anger coiled in Jax's gut. He recognized the old pattern. Some higher authority was about to tear away the one precious thing in his life. Not this time. He gritted his teeth, squaring his shoulders. Saris trembled, bracing for a fight. But Dr. Kaur managed to stall them, forging documents that claimed Saris was a research partner. The guards left, unconvinced but momentarily placated. That evening, Jax and Saris made a decision. They wouldn't wait for the next round of official scrutiny. They'd refuel, gather the star charts, and leave the planet in search of the rumored bioship. Dr. Kaur gave them partial coordinates. This is the best I can do, he said, handing Jax a data cylinder. Use caution. That region is known for gravitational anomalies. Saris thanked him, voice shaking with gratitude. On the landing pad, she gave the city one last glance. It is so beautiful. Here, she whispered. But not safe for us. Jax nodded, taking her hand. Come on. We have a new horizon to chase. They launched at dawn, the sunrise painting the water world in bands of gold. Saris watched the receding city with a wistful expression. Once in orbit, Jax set course for the uncharted sector. Ready? He asked, glancing at her. She met his eyes, a determined fire in her gaze. Yes. I want to see if my people live. And if not, we'll make our own place. He grinned, flipping the drive switch. The thrusters engaged, propelling them into the unknown. The journey took weeks. They skirted the edges of known space, navigating star systems rarely mapped. Each day blurred into the next, but they kept busy repairing small glitches, fine-tuning the sensors, and ensuring their bond stayed strong. When doubts crept in, they recalled each other's warmth, the memory of that first frantic need for water, or the way they'd fused minds and bodies in the bunk. Those recollections grounded them. At last, the sensors picked up an anomaly, a faint signature that matched dry energy patterns. Hope kindled in Saris's eyes. They followed the signal to a system bathed in pale, dying starlight. Amid swirling asteroid debris, they found it, a bioship drifting in silent orbit around a small, inhospitable planet. A massive, organic structure, vaguely whale-like in shape, pockmarked with damage. Saris's filaments pulsed wildly. It's my kin, she whispered, voice thick with emotion. They're alive? Jax asked. She shook her head, tears brimming. I sense flickers of life. Very weak. They approached cautiously, scanning for an airlock or opening. The structure's outer membrane seemed partially torn. Jax found a docking point that had once been symmetrical. Looks like it's been through hell, he muttered. Saris clenched her fists. Let us see if we can help. She insisted on going aboard. He agreed, though a knot of fear twisted in him. If her people were indeed aboard, would they accept him or view him as an intruder? Once they docked, Saris prepared a minimal suit. I can breathe in there if the organic systems function, but just in case, she explained. Jax nodded, donning his vac suit. They entered the bioship, stepping through a semi-organic hatch that sealed behind them with a wet slurp. Inside, the corridors pulsed with faint bioluminescence, a dim reflection of Saris's own glow. The air was humid, slightly warm, carrying the tang of decaying matter. Saris led the way, her hum resonating with the walls. Occasionally, she paused to place a palm against the fleshy surface, eyes closing in concentration. They are so weak, she whispered, heartbreak audible in her tone. Eventually, they reached what seemed like a central chamber, an open space lined with pods. Many were dark. Some flickered with faint light. Saris rushed to one, pressing her hands to the curved organic shell. She hummed in a low, mournful note. A faint response echoed. Jax watched, uneasy. He saw movement in a few pods, a stirring of limbs or filaments. At last, a single dry stepped from a damaged pod. This figure was taller, broader than Saris, filaments drooping in exhaustion. Their eyes locked on her, recognition flaring. A series of guttural hums passed between them. Jax couldn't understand, but from Saris's tearful reaction, it was some kind of greeting. The Dry's gaze shifted to Jax, curious but not immediately hostile. Over the next hour, Saris worked feverishly with them, restoring power to some part of the bioship's living tissues, offering water and ration fluid. Jax provided what supplies he could. The Dry pilot, if that was the right term, communicated in broken gestures that their vessel had suffered a catastrophic collision. Most of them were in stasis, too weak to move. They needed time, energy, and care to rebuild. Saris looked at Jax, tears running down her cheeks. I can help them. But it will take days, maybe weeks. The ship must heal. They must bond again. Jax glanced at the battered organ walls and the flickering lights. We'll do it, he said. We're not leaving them. We'll stay. So they stayed, living aboard the bioship. Each day, they labored to restore life support, hooking up a portable generator from Jax's ship. Saris shared her water, even letting the Dry absorb some of her own fluid in a bizarre, intimate ritual of transferring life essence. Jax tried not to gawk. He recognized the alien sacredness of the act, each Dry's filaments lighting up in gratitude. He quietly offered the canisters, ration packs, whatever it took to keep them alive. In the process, Saris and Jax grew closer still. At night, they retired to their cramped bunk on his vessel, limbs entwined. The risk of heartbreak was overshadowed by the joy of saving her people. Jax admired her strength, her unwavering dedication, even as she poured her own lifeblood, almost literally, into resurrecting the bioship. She reminded him that he, too, had once been willing to give everything to protect those he loved. Together, they found hope in that synergy. Eventually, the bioship stirred with renewed life. More Dry awoke from their pods, each forming a quiet, humming bond with Saris. One by one, they tested the ship's regenerative capabilities, though it would be months before it could truly sail the stars again. Their leader, a wizened Dry named Kaller, thanked Jax in halting Terran. You, help. You, friend of Dry. Jax felt awkward but touched, simply nodding. He looked at Saris, a wave of pride swelling in his chest. She'd found her people again, bridging the gap between their tragedies and forging a path forward. On the final day of repairs, Kaller approached Jax and Saris as they loaded supplies. Kaller's filaments were a deep shade of teal, a sign of calm gratitude. Saris, you stay with your kin? Kaller asked softly. Saris gazed at the half-repaired corridors, the flicker of the Dry's communal bond. Then she glanced at Jax. The question hung in the air. The entire reason they'd come was to find her people. Now they were found. Would she remain? Jax's heart hammered. He wanted to let her choose freely, even though his chest ached at the possibility of goodbye. Saris stepped forward, taking Kaller's hand. I love my people. I am Dry. But I am also bonded to him. She gestured at Jax, tears brimming. We have shared mind, body, sorrow, hope. I cannot abandon him. Kaller studied Jax, then nodded slowly. Then, we see you again, sister. Fly with him. But remember, you have a home among us. Saris bowed her head, pressing her brow to Kaller's in a tender gesture. Then she turned to Jax with a look of fierce resolve. My place is with you, she said, voice trembling. He swallowed, overwhelmed by relief and gratitude. Are you sure? He whispered. She nodded, placing a hand over his heart. Yes. This bond we share, it is my future. Kaller smiled, stepping aside. Other Dry hummed in agreement, releasing Ceres with blessings. She and Jax returned to their ship for the last time, hearts pounding in unison. As the airlock sealed, they held hands in the corridor, letting the weight of the moment settle. The future loomed, uncertain and daunting, but they had each other. That night, they stood on the bridge and gazed at the battered bioship drifting amid the stars. "You found what was left of your family," Jax murmured. "And still you choose me. I don't know if I can ever." She silenced him with a soft kiss, her filaments flickering in a rainbow of affection. "We are more than we were alone," she whispered. "I choose to move forward, not backward." He brushed his thumb over her cheek, tears pricking his eyes. For the first time since the tragedy that had defined him, he felt the possibility of a future that wasn't weighed down by grief. "Then let's move forward together," he said. Their foreheads touched, luminescence merging in the dim cockpit. In that hush, they felt the echoes of water shared, tears shed, lives saved, and worlds left behind. And they knew, as they set course for the next star, that they had forged an unbreakable bond, two drifting souls now woven into one story, forever changed by love.